I've had so many people tell me that they feel like their childhood was a lie, and as 30, 40, 50-year-old adults, they're still navigating, what's true in the world. They're just sort of disillusioned. As many of you already know, I was a Baptist minister for a while. I went to a Baptist college. I was ordained as a Baptist minister and had plans of becoming a military chaplain, but I nearly left the faith. And I've been watching a lot of deconstruction videos over the last few days. You'll excuse my voice, I have coronavirus and I'm still recovering from it, but I've used that time to sort of reflect on my own journey and listen to the journey of many more people. It's very common now, as you know, for people to leave the Christian faith and sort of deconvert from the faith that they grew up with. And a common phrase is deconversion. Now, I don't think that deconversion and deconstruction are synonymous. In my own case, I did sort of go through a deconstruction period, but I remained a Christian. So I wanted to share my own thoughts on this, and I realize I might take a little bit of heat from various sides of the issue, but I'm going to share my thoughts as they are. And my intention is not to be judgmental towards you or to be harsh, but I'm just going to share some things that I worked through and why I nearly left the faith, but what ultimately helped me decide to see the value in Christianity and stay with it. Right off the bat, no matter what I say or how I say this, it might seem a judgmental to some people. So I want to try to say this in the most kind way I possibly can, but it might seem as though I'm being judgmental on the evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who helped me so many years ago. That's not my intention. However, I really can relate to so many people who have struggled with the faith and sort of feel lost and disillusioned and not sure where to go. And so I think I just have to be sort of upfront about this. So if you went through or are going through a deconstruction period, feel free to share, what caused you to go on that journey. But I will say right off the bat, I grew up in a home that was affiliated with Christianity. I mean, we had a Bible in the home. We went to church occasionally on and off. In the life of an adult, my parents, probably taking long periods of time off from church seemed fine. But when you're a child, taking long periods of time off from church is a long period of time for someone growing up, in the formative years of your life. As a teenager, we started going to church quite regularly. And I think some of my family sort of quit going. And I decided, I was just going to keep going. I knew that I needed God. And the church that I went to was a fundamentalist, very Southern Baptist type of a church. Now, I can still say good things about those people, so I don't mean to be too harsh, but my experiences at these and other churches, I ran with Southern Baptist, fundamentalist, independent Baptist, later non-denominational type of Christians. I can understand those who grew up really rooted in those churches and just really felt disillusioned. And here's why. Some of the things that I experienced in some of those churches were quite frankly negative. Not everything was, but if I'm being just blunt, things that I experienced there did give me pause later and sort of gnawed at me and caused me to ask questions later. So one thing I did experience at one or two of these churches off the top of my head was open racism. Now, I think we live in an age in which everything is called racism. Sometimes things that aren't actually racist or people who aren't actually racist are called racism. We're too quick to make the accusation of extreme prejudice when none exists. And yet, I did hear the N-word thrown around, a couple times, and not even in a joking way, but as intended to be an actual racial insult. That was, I'm a millennial. That was just, to me, unnecessary. I remember standing up to an older leader. He's a white man. And standing up to him when he threw around the N-word for, a black man. And I remember just feeling just kind of aghast and pushed back and tried to correct this man as gently as I could. But, that did stick with me. There was also this mentality, and I think a much broader problem than the racism that can be in some churches, is just the idea of fear. I've talked to so many people, and the ideas that they have of church, of God, is that God is sort of a big bully. He's just this mean person who's terrifying, like an angry, vindictive father, just waiting for you to mess up so he can sort of just punish you. He's just going to zap you. And so many people I know who have left active faith just have this view that God is just a bad person. And that doesn't sit well with them when they grow up and are no longer scared of a vindictive father figure. They sort of tend to leave that view behind. There's also the view, this element of fear in which in the fundamentalist churches, and I think evangelical churches, though I think this is sort of changing, the idea that you're warned to not read or think or explore ideas outside of a very tight box that they allow you to think inside of. In a fundamentalist church, I've studied the history of fundamentalism in America, and over the decades, since the 1920s, from the 1860s, fundamentalism has become increasingly anti-intellectual, whereas the original fundamentalists were quite well-read, educated church leaders fighting against specific things. I've found that, contemporary fundamentalists often just fight against everything and have really sort of devolved into this just a small box that they think is a biblical box. It's not. And any sort of exploration of art, cinema, philosophy, history, culture outside of this box they give you is seen as suspect or sinful or worldly. And it's very limiting. And a lot of people grow up and you're sort of told, this is all there is. Anything outside of this box is bad. And then, of course, you start exploring ideas, or you start meeting people outside of your fundamentalist circles who are nice people, who are intelligent, and who think differently. And you think, man, well, that's an interesting idea. And you sort of have a mental tension between the box that you're handed as a fundamentalist young person and the world at large. And I think a lot of people don't know how to navigate the waters outside of that box. And it's actually created some really strange views people have. I know some fundamentalist people who try to remain fundamentalist, and they'll still think that Pokemon is witchcraft or something, but they'll allow themselves to watch, extreme R-rated movies. Like, they don't always seem to have a clear guidelines for navigating the world outside of this. But I think there's this general element of fear about intellectual things. I think also that the next step from that is when you go to college or you talk to people outside of fundamentalism or evangelicalism, you find out that it's not as cut and dry. Evidence for the age of the earth is pretty solidly on the side of the old earth. Now, I'm not against someone believing that the earth is quite young, if they're a young earth creationist. But as a young earth creationist, at the time, people really sort of attached the gospel itself to that. And people like Answers in Genesis, and to think that the earth could possibly be older than 6,000 or 10,000 years was seen as like a cardinal issue. And they were willing to die on that hill. But then, you start arguing and debating with people who think the earth is older, and you find out it's a very plausible view, scientifically, to think that the earth is much older than that. And it's not so cut and dry. It's not as though everyone who believes the earth is older than 10,000 years is a terrible atheist or something like this. Well, this just sort of starts to break down the way you were ingrained as a child, or me as a teenager, to think about the world. That those walls, you find out the walls of that box are paper thin, and the box just starts collapsing around you. And in my case, I wasn't sure, you know, I wasn't ready to, I came to the place where I nearly gave up on Christianity altogether. But I just really had to pause and think things through, and I studied a lot of things for a lot of years. But a lot of people, when that paper-thin cathedral collapses around them, they're just lost. It's sort of like you feel like I've had so many people tell me that they feel like their childhood was a lie. And as 30, 40, 50-year-old adults, they're still navigating, what's true in the world. They're just sort of disillusioned. Now, this is also something, unfortunately, I've seen and detest, but I've heard stories from so many people who left churches like this, and I saw it myself. Sometimes there is, sort of dated views of women that I don't think are biblical views or historic Christian views, but are sort of the creation of a certain cultural context. And I've seen women be, abused, physically abused, and pastor figures would not protect those women, but would sort of almost question the woman as to what she did wrong that caused this husband or this man to strike her or something like this. That's I'm gonna stay calm in this video, but that's deeply upsetting. And I think one thing I wish my older Christian friends would realize about younger people deconstructing is sometimes they have had terrible experiences, and they just don't know what they can trust or who, and they no longer will trust pastoral figures. They're just not going to do it. There have been child abuse cover-ups in various denominations. Instead of just removing a man from ministry who's abused underage girls sexually, they will, just sort of move him to a different ministry position or give him time off. Now, I can name after name after name of big name Christians that if I named them, you would know. Some in just various denominations, Baptist, evangelical. The Catholic Church has had priests who are predatory, and I don't think the church really dealt with this quickly enough at the time. Now, all these movements, I think, are probably hopefully trying to reform their processes of dealing with this. I know the Catholic Church has. But nevertheless, you still have a lot of people who have friends who were abused or went through terrible things. All the while, these Christians are preaching morality when they have sort of hypocritical things in their own circles. So for me, another thing was I heard Christians, including Christian leaders, say absolutely absurd things. I mean, they would argue for things that were just clearly untrue and give the worst arguments. At the time, I hadn't studied formal logic, but I could still tell this doesn't logically follow at all. There is no way that this is true. Well, eventually, that was sort of like pulling a thread on a tapestry, and the more you just pull at it, the more the tapestry comes undone. And for me, I wasn't sure if the entire tapestry of faith would just come unwoven. But that started causing me to question, wait. Okay, how do I know any of this is true? This is absurd. You don't want me to think or explore outside of the very slim, small box you've given me. And the things inside that box sometimes seem blatantly untrue or illogical. And you just tell me to believe. All the while there are serious, moral problems and almost like a cultist defense of church leaders who are in the wrong. This was just hurtful to me. And the truth of the matter is, I can just sympathize with people who go through this and just sort of begin to leave the faith or just ask the question, what are we doing here? For my own part, I started to, ask the question, why do we know God exists in the first place? How do I know Jesus existed in history? Another element for me was, in a fundamentalist Baptist church, we had a very high view of what's called biblical inerrancy. And that's a dense topic I won't get into, but in a very modern American fundamentalist view, we focus so heavily on every word being perfect that we almost had a modernist view of inerrancy, and that backfired on me hard. So I began to read the Bible very seriously in my early adulthood. I'd read it for years coming into church, and then I just read it more and more in depth. But the honest truth is, if you just compare parallel accounts in the Gospels, there are differences. There is just no denying this. Or if you compare parallel accounts of Chronicles and Kings, you're going to find things that are slightly different. Now, mingled with the view told to me by my fundamentalist mentors that every word of God is pure, there can be no possible difference in this book. There can be no error. And then the way they saw an error didn't match the text itself. So the classic example I give is Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Just one example. The narration of the events, the three temptations of Christ in the wilderness, are given out of order. So there's three of them, but Luke and Matthew flips the last two around. And things like that and a bunch of other things really just started to, hit me. Is this inerrancy thing untrue? So I went through, I think, a longer period of time just wondering, is the Bible inerrant? What does that even mean? How do you match that to the text? And most of the Christian defenses of these things just seemed indefensible to me, just like they were playing mental gymnastics to make it work. I don't think Christianity is the only religion to do this with their sacred book, but I did see that with certain types of Christians. Okay, so here's another reason I think people are deconstructing. One reason is people today are so absurdly busy and stressed, isolated. We have trouble making and maintaining friendships. We have trouble doing anything besides just work. I feel like life is a bad balance at this point between working yourself into exhaustion and then trying to come home to veg just to try to recover in front of a Netflix or something. And this is not a healthy balance, but so many people live this day to day that they're just exhausted, they're stressed. Economically times are tough right now. Society's becoming so negative and losing optimism and hope that these things really weigh on people. And so going to church, especially when you don't know why you're going and you have questions, just seems like almost a waste of energy. And so people really begin to question whether or not the shallow friendships they might have there, or the time involved with the shallow Bible lesson or whatever, the way they see it, is even worth it. And then, of course, there really are changing views of sexuality in the modern world. Now, this is, I think, actually a very complex topic that I can't cover in detail here. But a Pew Research survey, I think, one of the surveys, mentioned that more and more millennials and then Gen Z people have friends who identify with the LGBTQ community, and they're having trouble reconciling their friendships or their own views of their own gender, identity, sexuality with the evangelical Christianity that they grew up with. Now, I think there are several reasons for this. It's a very complicated topic. Some of it is bad argumentation from Christians, quoting from the Old Testament. Some of it is misunderstandings of the people who grew up with this evangelical understanding. And I think some of it is just genuine concern for people who they think are bullied. Now, I'm not defending this, but this is what I think has happened. Millennials are typically non-confrontational. I think some of the older generations would fight and argue about a lot of more things a lot more quickly. Millennials typically tend to try to avoid conflict at most costs. The one time millennials will really dig their feet in and fight is if they think someone is being bullied. Some instinct seems to kick in. Maybe it's because of the Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street and all the things we grew up watching, but seeing someone who's bullied, including a friend who identifies with that movement, seemed to sort of trigger something that we go into defense mode. Also, I know in my own case, hearing things from the pulpit about LGBTQ people that were gross generalizations, well, then when you meet them in real life, who are just very kind people who, enjoy the same things you enjoy, they just, for whatever reason, I think it's a complex issue, identify with that movement. You realize, well, they're not the way they were presented in that sermon I heard in, the 90s. And so people tend to have a tension, I think, between the faith they grew up with, the sexual ethics they grew up with, and then the very changing sexual ethics of the world today. And I will throw this in there. I don't think this is the fundamental element for everybody, but if you're deconstructing, I do want you to just ask yourself this question. There is sort of the ability, I will say that sexual sin, let's say pornography, is so extremely accessible today. I think too accessible, to where we can sort of just very cheaply and easily fulfill any whim or desire so quickly. I think this is actually adding to depression, and it's not been good for women or men. But there is sort of that desire, I think, to do certain things that is, of course, going to be a temptation, especially today. You can give to charity and be nice and try to fight against the bigots, but also just kind of do what you want to make yourself feel good. I think that can be a temptation for some people who deconstruct. I'm not saying that's you. I'm just saying you should just have some self-awareness and ask yourself if that's an element somewhere deep down. To make all this worse, I have seen a lot of Christian responses to the mass deconstruction. I mean, there are, contemporary Christian music, worship leaders, and, pastors and all these figures and massive amount of people who are leaving the faith or who are deconstructing. And the Christian responses to this have not always been good. Now, I think there are cases in which, as Paul says about Demas, you might have known this is true, but you've allowed yourself to become blinded so that you can, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved the present world. He just wants to go sin. And I think it's important to realize that might be an element, but I want to say that it's also important to realize I just don't think that's the only element for everybody. So please, if you're a Christian or a pastor, just be aware of that. Some people are genuinely just hurting and sort of feel lost. Okay, real talk. If you are deconstructing, if you're considering leaving the faith or have left the faith, I'd like to just share with you a few suggestions. I'm not judging you. I'm not trying to be harsh. These are things that I had to think very deeply about, and it caused me pause in my deconstruction, okay? When I realized that there were certain things about the Christianity I was handed that weren't entirely true, I questioned whether any of it was true. But the reality is, some of it is almost definitely true. And it's very important, I think, to draw, to sort of put a hierarchy of truths, right? We shouldn't, if this is the core of Christianity, if whatever this is the heart of Christianity, all the little secondary and tertiary doctrines that modern Christianity has attached to that gospel, if some of those aren't true or aren't entirely true, or maybe are just misrepresented, they might have attached that to the gospel itself, and when you find out it's not true, you question the heart of the gospel. I'm going to suggest that instead, realize that if this particular view of inerrancy isn't true, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. That's not logical. For example, if I could never find a way to make sense of why Matthew and Mark and Luke list things in slightly different orders at times, does that logically follow that God himself doesn't exist? It just doesn't even logically follow. Does it follow that Jesus didn't exist in history? No. Now, I understand that you may not be sure about that, but just sort of put some guardrails on your own thinking. Don't, I think for me, in my case, it was pain, disillusionment, sometimes anger, confusion, would really cloud my clarity of thought and allow me to emotionally go to darker places and to leave the faith more and more than really were warranted. And my feeling as though I was flourishing and the freedom in exploring broader ideas outside of fundamentalist Christianity, I felt so much more satisfied. But even in that, try to be clear with yourself. Be fair. Treat Christianity not as a fundamentalist. If you've left fundamentalism, leave fundamentalism. Don't look back and judge Christianity through a fundamentalist mindset like so many atheists do. It's not wise. Now, to my Christian friends, I hope you understand that some people if you're a grounded Christian person, you might think they're not thinking clearly about this. Well, they may not be, but sometimes when you're hurt and you're wounded, clarity of thought isn't what you're concerned with. You're just hurting, you're angry, you're in pain. So sometimes I think grace and compassion is warranted here. So what I did was I studied a lot. I studied philosophy, theology, history, culture. I read arguments for and against belief in God, in Christianity. Now for me back in the day it was Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, all these guys. But then I read older atheists like Friedrich Nietzsche and Feuerbach, and I began to see a couple of things that were interesting. Modern secular atheism is actually quite shallow. The arguments that, the old sort of heroes of mine like Dawkins and Hitchens would level against Christianity are really just usually bad. I mean, sometimes the arguments would be rejected forthright by atheist trained philosophers because they're just so absurdly bad. But if you come out of a fundamentalist mindset where you don't know, you just hear this intelligent, Oxford-educated guy lambasting Christianity. And for me, some of these things resonated. Christianity is anti-science. Christianity is anti-minority. Christianity can be hazardous to women. And because of my experiences, those things resonated with me. But it just didn't follow that their arguments against Christianity, the core of Christianity itself, were valid. I'll give you some book recommendations in a minute, but another thing that I think is very difficult to encapsulate in just a few words, but I would invite you to consider. When I was growing up in the 90s, I'm getting a little older now, but, late 80s through early 2000s, there was almost this feeling of tension between, Christianity and the world, and it was this binary division, Christianity against the world. And Christianity was actually kind of this small box, and the world is this massive place. But you almost had the idea that Christianity, that secularism, was this sort of default, right? And to leave Christianity was by default to become a secularist, almost an agnostic or atheist. And I think what a lot of people are now is not aggressive atheists, though many are. A lot of them are just sort of don't cares. I don't see the relevance of faith. I don't know that it's true. Until you can convince me, I don't care. But here's the thing, looking back over history, secularism is not the default. I mean, ask yourself the question why people around the world and every civilization, I'm talking about from the native peoples who lived on this continent, the Sioux, the Choctaw, others, to people in Asia, to people like Lao Tzu in China, early, philosophical thinkers in China pre-Christ, to the pagans, Aristotle and Plato, really all had some concept of the divine. Plato and Aristotle, I think, can be argued, realized that there was a prime mover or the one or a God that existed outside of and above the gods of the Greek pantheon. Why is it that people find this, they resonate so deeply with belief in God, the transcendent realm? Why is it in the modern world, only recently, have we begun to reduce the world to material components, to consumerism? Eating McDonald's and Taco Bell and watching Netflix and just trying to be up to date with what's current on TikTok or whatever, the latest slang, this is a very recent thing. This is not the default. And secularism has been extremely aggressive, not neutral, in promoting its own ideology. So many times people leave Christianity and become agnostic, atheists, don't cares. It's not as though they're neutral, just accepting things only based on evidence. Not remotely. There are positive arguments. It's not a vacuum. There are things that secularism absolutely promotes, and I think this is evidenced in some of the more recent views in the LGBTQ movement. That movement itself has changed in the last 20, 30 years, and I think it's going to continue morphing. Secularism is not neutral. It's aggressive, and it's always changing without anything to ground it. So ask yourself the question why you would go from being a Muslim or a Christian or an Orthodox Jew and then just accepting default all the things in this sort of secular view. Where did those views come from? Are they just the natural default that humans before Christianity believed? It's just not the case. Okay, so I know this is going to get pushback, but I really want you to try to be objective in this. It's very clear that the LGBTQ movement, especially at this point in history, is also not being neutral. This movement has become extremely aggressive. So it's not as though they are... So back in 2008 through 2012 or so, I watched the Obama administration and the Abergefell Hodges case in the Supreme Court sort of argue that the Supreme Court, the federal government needs to be more hands-off and neutral, and what we were told is we just need to be kind and not enforce a religious view of marriage into the private lives of homosexual people or something like this. In other words, the federal government should be more neutral in all this. Reading that Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court actually made a positive affirmation of moral good. But since that moment, when we were told it was just that, a libertarian view of the federal government's backing away from imposing, and that these people are free to live neutrally in privacy, this movement has changed quite a bit to being aggressive and I'm not trying to be mean, I know I'll get pushback, but I think by any objective standard, in pushing really their way, their vision of society on people who are Muslim, Christian, Orthodox Jew, any other, worldview around the world. This is taking a positive movement towards reshaping society and to their vision. So I'm not trying to be gutless. People on the right, say I'm not being harsh enough. I'm just trying to be calm, and people on the left think I'm being bigoted. So, but I hope you can see, if you're deconstructing and just, you watched Neil Patrick Harris or something, and you say, well, a lot of these people are nice. Yes, I understand that. I think as this movement has gained more and more influence in entertainment, in Hollywood, in Nashville, and public institutions that have say, more and more people who've grown up under that influence their minds and hearts have been changed. In fact, where the people originally running these movements have openly said that's what they're seeking out to do. And those are the people I have some sort of compassion for, sympathy for. If you grew up with this and you have, angry, narrow-minded people on the right, you feel like you're bullied and you're confused, but then you identify with what this movement is telling you, I can sort of sympathize with you. I have no sympathy for the thought leaders like Foucault or Jean-Paul Sartre. No sympathy at all for the ideologies that they were pushing. I've traced some of those ideas from Karl Marx through Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault to Judith Butler's gender theory. And these things work themselves out over the decades. They might start in academia, but they work themselves out into movies and films and music. And then you feel pressured to think that these are the default. I remember Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl and I Liked It, or Will and Grace, or all these different things that were promoting a certain lifestyles that we now feel pressure to accept. Now, I'm not trying to be unkind. I think we should always be kind, but I'm just asking you to understand that this is not a default neutral position. It's a morphing, changing position that came from a certain gender theory through a certain philosophy from the sexual revolution. And people in that movement might be in that movement for different reasons. They might feel differently. But those ideas have affected the movement from academia, from people who died before we were born. Which is also why I, as a Christian, feel like I should have some compassion. There are some people who know something is just wrong and they're going to do it anyway. I think we all do that to some degree. But there are other people who are literally just disillusioned and lost, but they're nice people. And as a Christian, I do feel like I should be kind to those people. So a suggestion is, if the Christianity that you were handed as a child was shallow, don't think that all Christianity is shallow. What I'd invite you to do is read deeper historical, more grounded Christian theology. So here's just a couple suggestions. If you're a serious-minded person, St. Augustine's Confessions is a really great one. He's a guy who struggled with sexual sin. He wanted to do something that was wrong, and he did it anyway, but eventually he found a different kind of freedom in Christ. He also got mixed up in a false ideology, and over the years he began to realize that that ideology was false, and he began to see the fullness of truth in historic Christendom, what I would say is Catholicism. So if you were handed a very shallow, narrow-minded, anti-intellectual Christianity, just understand that's the product of various cultural movements in the modern world, maybe even particularly in America or the West, but that's not historic Christianity. In fact, a suggestion is, even if you do leave the faith, and I hope you don't, but if you do, I think it's very important to realize just how much, how deeply, how broad Christianity has really shaped the world. There's an atheist historian named Tom Holland. He's now famously said, even if you think that you're an atheist, you might overlook just how deeply your views of the world, your caring for people in the LGBTQ movement, are formed by centuries, millennia, of Christianity revolutionizing the world. The fact that you feel like those people are bullied and you want to look out for them, that is something that was shaped by Christianity. Views of moral worth, the dignity of humanity, human rights, natural law, hospitals themselves, these things were just influenced by Christianity. You know, I bought for a while because there were many Christians who were patently anti-science. I bought the idea that when the atheist said Christianity is anti-science, I said, yeah. Now I've lived a little longer now and realized that science is an institution, institutions full of people. I'm sorry to say, I think sometimes those institutions with people have become pressured by corporations or government bodies to defend certain views that the science itself doesn't dictate, but also that some religious people are patently anti-science. And yet some people who aren't religious can also be very superstitious and anti-science. There are people today who are not religious who think that the earth is flat. So this is a more complicated issue than that, but what I found out is that Christianity really was, even science was shaped by Christian philosophy and thinking over the centuries. So if you struggle with whether or not Jesus existed, if there's any evidence for his resurrection, it depends on how serious of a thinker and reader you are. This is The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. It's a good layman's level book who just discusses some of the historical evidence. Now, I don't fully condone everything in this. You know, I myself, when I deconstructed the things about my fundamentalist faith, eventually wound up becoming a Catholic rather than an atheist. And I submit what I say to the authority of the Catholic Church. But I don't know that everything in this book is true, but I'm sure some of it is true. This is a book by Mike Licona, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I think he even has a newer book that is more geared towards the lay reader. This is basically just saying that if we take the Gospels as ancient biographies rather than modern ones, a lot of the differences there really, they begin to just not be problems at all. The reason that they would be problems is probably due to a sort of fundamentalist read of the Bible. And if you struggle with whether or not Jesus existed at all, there are ancient historians who talk about the life of Jesus. Now, they weren't debating the things that we're debating, so I'm not going to give you a full answer. But there was a Roman historian, just for example, who mentioned this pesky figure named Christus or Crestus, and other figures who just give credence to the idea that Jesus of Nazareth certainly existed, that he was crucified by the Romans, and that people thought he rose again in that time. This isn't something invented. This isn't copied and pasted from pagan myths at the Council of Nicaea by Constantine or something. Now, I don't fully condone everything this gentleman says either, but the late Maurice Casey is a legitimate scholar and historian. He says Jesus, Evidence and Arguments, or Mythicist Myths. He just sort of takes down the absurd internet atheist ideas that Jesus of Nazareth didn't exist at all. So even Bart Ehrman wrote a book talking about whether or not Jesus existed. It's just called Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth by Bart Ehrman. I will say also, some of the sources, early sources from history that were Christian, outside the New Testament, attesting to the life of Jesus, reading those, when evangelical scholars cite them, showing, hey, people, Jewish, pagan, and Christian, early on, very early, knew that Jesus existed, and there were certain things about him they all said. Well, when I read those sources, for me that was, it was a game changer, because I realized that the earliest Christians were more liturgical. They were Catholic. For example, Ignatius of Antioch. Now here's the resurrection of Jesus. This is a bit of a beastie book. This is for if you're just really wanting to go in depth. But I'd also recommend reading some of the classic texts, like the Imitation of Christ or the Confessions of St. Augustine. I think you'll see, just for reading through those things, that Christianity has a lot of relevance. So my advice would be, if you have to deconstruct, understandably, the incorrect things about the faith you were handed, it doesn't mean that you should deconvert. In my own case, it meant trying to be very honest about the problems in the fundamentalist churches when I was in my youth, but also trying to remember the good things. I don't think people are a zero-sum game. We all have issues. We're all, hopefully in a growth process, and I try to remember the good too. So as I deconstruct the things that are incorrect, what I'd invite you to do is sort of reconstruct something more solid. And for me, ironically, it was exploring the ideas that fundamentalism sort of outlawed that led to me going deeper in my Christian faith. And though the reality of my life is not always easy, sometimes life is quite hard, the reality is my faith is more relevant to me now, and I think a more deeper, more integrated way into every facet of my life than my fundamentalist faith was when it was sort of compartmentalized years ago. For example, appreciation of the great art of the world is going to lead you back to Catholicism. Appreciation of the great music of the world, if you listen to classical music or pre-modern music, you're going to bump into a deeply Christian canon of music and art and literature. You can't understand the poetry of the Western tradition without understanding Christianity. It's just deeply ingrained, from Milton to Shakespeare to John Donne. I mean, even Jane Austen and things like this, there are just Christian elements just deeply embedded. And also, I know a lot of people who don't attend church can be a lot nicer than some of the people who attend church. It's a fact. However, I would like for you to just take some serious time and consider, as the world becomes less Christian, is it becoming genuinely more advanced, more kind, more truthful? I'm not seeing that take place. I would say from the 1700s through really the early 1900s through now, more and more and more, you have waves of de-Christianization, and you have waves of more and more terrible things taking place, from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution to World War I and II to increasing, I think, actually mistreatment of women. If you see problems in certain elements of Christian denominations that are bad towards women or anti-science, one of your options is to reconstruct into something deeper, a deeper faith. And the relevance of this is, sometimes I try to put on a brave face, but the reality is sometimes your life is hard and sometimes my life is hard, and you just have to do your best when you don't have all the answers. But I think that believing that God exists, that Christ is true, this has given me just immense, sort of unshakable hope that no matter what happens in this life, in the end, goodness does win. Justice isn't something that's arbitrary. It's not just a material, abstract concept. Beauty and hope are real features of the world. And I think Christianity makes so much more sense of this. So do me a favor, if you would. Share, if you're comfortable, why it is that you deconstructed or are deconstructing. And I would like to just ask you, one, to be charitable to each other in the comments. There's going to be people who disagree, perhaps, but just sort of reconsider and put those guardrails on, and don't go further than the evidence warrants. If you have troubles with certain forms of your Christianity, it doesn't mean that you should just leave the thing altogether. Sometimes there are better places to go, and for me, I think I'm quite confident that I found that in the Catholic Church. Hey, but whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you know your life matters. There's someone somewhere who loves you, and I hope you're taking care of yourself. As always, thanks for watching. God bless.